Thank you for coming tonight and supporting us. You look terrific. We appreciate your coming out in the heat. Tenemos la buena fortuna esta noche, en estos tiempos tan turbulentes, de tener un huésped esta noche con raíces firmemente en las Américas Norte y Sur. We have the good fortune in these divisive times to have a guest tonight with roots firmly planted in Las Américas North and South. Marie Arana is an author of fiction as well as nonfiction, a journalist, an editor, an administrator, an advisor nationally as well as internationally, and a historian. María Arana es autora de ficción y no ficción, periodista, editora, administradora, consejera de nivel nacional, tanto como internacional, y ahora puedo añadir historian, pero no sé cómo decir historian, historiadora, ¿no? ¿Se dice? She's a senior advisor to the U.S. Library of Congress, director of the National Book Festival, and a writer at large for the Washington Post. Es consejera superior a la Biblioteca Nacional de los Estados Unidos y directora de la Festival del Libro Nacional y escritora para el Washington Post. Por muchos años fue redactora jefe del Washington Post suplemento literario, Book World, and for many years she was editor-in-chief of Washington Post's literary section, Book World. She has also written for various newspapers, including the New York Times, Spain's El País, and Peru's El Comercio, as well as magazines like the National Geographic, among other publications. También ha escrito por varios periódicos, incluso el New York Times, El País de España, El Comercio de Perú, tanto como revistas como el National Geographic y varias otras. Sus dos novelas aclamadas incluyen también una biografía de Simón Bolívar que ganó el premio 2014 del Los Angeles Times y también es autora de una memoria, American Chica, que fue finalista para el National Book Award. Her books include two acclaimed novels, a biography of Simón Bolívar, which won the 2014 Los Angeles Times Book Prize, and a memoir, American Chica, which was a finalist for the National Book Award. For all who are lucky enough to know and be known by Marie, she is a behind-the-scenes champion on behalf of writers and literature, especially Latino writers, and especially U.S. Latino writers, and for this I'm deeply grateful. Somos muy afortunadas de conocer a Marie porque ella trabaja entre las bambalinas de parte de escritores y de parte de la literatura, pero especialmente de parte de escritores latinoamericanos, y por eso estoy profundamente agradecida. She'll be reading tonight from her forthcoming book, Silver, Sword, and Stone, 3 Crucibles of the Latin American Story. And I want to add that I found out at lunch that Marie speaks 6 languages, which I think is worth mentioning. También quiero añadir que aprendí hoy que Marie habla 6 idiomas. Alguien me mandó un texto por correo electrónico hoy y me dijeron, she is much loved, bien querida. And I have to thank Marie for taking the time. She is on her way back from Peru to the States, and she took the time, like many in our series, to stop here and donate her expertise and energy on our behalf. So estamos muy agradecidas, María Arana.
Buenas tardes, me pueden oír, escuchar. Me da tanto placer estar aquí en México. It gives me such pleasure to be here in Mexico because I have so many ties to Mexico, not least of which is named Sandra Cisneros, a very good friend, amiga del corazón, del alma, realmente, because we understand each other, I think, in so many ways. Mainly, I think, Sandra, we don't even need to talk. You know, we have a special bond. I've known her for at least 25 years. We're not counting at this point. Somos muy amigas. Muchas gracias, Sandra. I want to thank 2PEN, an organization for which I have tremendous respect. As somebody who has dedicated my life to books, it seems to me that there are few organizations in this world that do the kind of indispensable work on behalf of writers. So I thank you, PEN, for all you do and for even raising the consciousness and the awareness far-flung places and getting you all involved, which is very, very important. ¿Cuántos amigos de nosotros tenemos acá que son hispanoparlantes que no entienden inglés? No hay nadie. Ay, qué suerte. Okay, that makes less work for me. Thank you very much. I wanted to say that I'm presenting tonight, and thanks to Sandra and to Signe Hammer and to Susan in the back who is helping out, to Lucina, to Diego in the back, the sound engineer. I'm presenting tonight something that doesn't exist, and that is my book that is coming out in August. Sitting now on my table by the door in Washington, D.C., are the page proofs of the book, and I'm headed back to deal with them. So you are hearing about something that is yet to be born, and there's a kind of nervousness I think we authors have in a book that is yet to be born. There's so much that can happen. It's the experience of writing is such a personal experience. You hold it within, and then you release it to the world, and it's no longer yours. It's like a child that goes out on its own, and you're not responsible for it anymore. And there are people who will read it in different ways and react to it in different ways and accept it in different ways. And that's a marvelous experience, but it's nervous-making in this time before you actually publish. So I wanted to say that my connections with Mexico begin, well, a long time ago. I lived in Mexico City for a year and a half as a 27-year-old young woman with a fairly new marriage and a 4-year-old child. And it struck me then, and it still has stayed with me ever since, that we have strong bonds between Peru and Mexico, not to mention the bonds with the United States. But the bonds with Peru are really extraordinary because, and my book, Silver, Sword, and Stone, can be read as a kind of axis between the Andes and Mexico, because there's so much in common. The indigenous part that lives on in us, the kind of spiritual connections. I have made a game, really, of making those connections. When I decided, when I decided to start writing, because my career was mainly in editing books, in being a books editor for a newspaper, and then suddenly I decided to write. And that was because of my husband, Jonathan Yardley, who is a literary critic, and he said, give it up, write yourself, don't rewrite other people, write yourself. And that inspired me about 20 years ago. Every single book that I have written is trying to explain who we are in Latin America, what we're made of, what we come from, and why we are so different from the rest of the world, and certainly from the United States of America, a country that we as expatriates and immigrants coming to the United States of America, my mother was North American, so I had that very early knowledge. But I came still to the United States of America, to North America, as an immigrant. And yet, that immigrant status, I think, inspires so many of us in creative ways. It certainly inspired me. I began writing first American Chica, which was a memoir of my childhood between two worlds, between a father who was Peruvian and a mother who was from the United States, from Kansas, and the joys and the difficulties and the frightening aspect of losing ground when you are standing on two places or walking a bridge at all times. So I started with American Chica. As Sandra said, I went on to try to explain Peru and its racial structure in a novel called Cellophane. And then another, that was a very sort of big epic novel that had a lot of characters and a lot of emotion, a lot of history. And then in another book, Lima Nights, I tried to explain something of the urban world and the clash and synthesis of races in the urban world. And then I sat sort of like a parlor game to say, what can I write next that takes in as much territory as I can, that tells as much history as possible, to explain why the revolutions that made us as Latin Americans and us as North Americans so different. And when I sat and thought, what life can I tell that captures the drama, the expanse, the terrain, and I came up with Simón Bolívar, which opened up a world for me, because now I think history has become my passion, which is why I have written this book, Silver Sword and Stone. Another parlor game, trying to arrive at some semblance of things that explain perhaps not the happy parts of being Latin American, but the challenges and the character that we carry with us, the burdens that we carry with us, that history has imposed on us. And those were silver, mining, the sort of taking out the heart and soul from Pachamama, from the earth beneath our feet, and giving it away, sending it away. That's silver. Sword, which is the violence we have lived with and continue to live with. And stone, which is the faith that sustains us, that sometimes is imposed on us, that sometimes is inflicted on us. And these three things, I thought, might actually give people an idea of the character of the people. So this is really a history of the character of the people that I tried to put together, and it's 1,000 years of history. I feel so honored to be in San Miguel de Allende, because you have here, on this ground, silver, sword, and stone. San Miguel de Allende was a town through which all the silver poured as it went out from the mines from Zacatecas and Guanajuato to the rest of the world. It poured through here. The first casonas that were built here were mining casonas, people who worked in getting the silver and the gold, because there was gold as well, out into the world. Why sword? Because San Miguel de Allende has had an incredibly violent past, because Allende himself was a revolutionary hero who the Grito de Dolores passed through here. The revolutions, uprisings, there has been a lot of actual blood on the streets in San Miguel de Allende. So sword is here. Stone is here by virtue of San Miguel himself. Jose San Miguel, who founded this city, who came as so many priests have come, curas have come, ¿cómo se dice? Monjas? Thank you. Have come to create a universe of faith in a foreign land and develop it and grow it. So you are full of silver, sword, and stone here. So I hope you'll allow me to read the first pages of this book. In many ways, you are the first people to hear it. So without further ado, here we go. In the stinging cold before dawn, Leonor Gonzalez leaves her stone hut on a glacial mountain peak in the Peruvian Andes to trudge up a path and scour rock spills for flecks of gold. Like generations before her, she has teetered under heavy bags of stone, pounded it with crude hammer, ground it to gravel with her feet, crushed it to a fine sand. On rare, lucky days, she teases out infinitesimally small motes of gold by swirling the grit in a mercury solution. She's only 47, but her teeth are gone. Her face is cooked by relentless sun, parched by the freezing winds. Her hands are the color of cured meat, the fingers humped and gnarled. She is partially blind, but every day, as the sun peeks over the icy promontory of Mount Arana, she joins the women of La Rinconada, the highest human habitation in the world, to scale the steep escarpments that lead toward the mines, scavenging for all that shines, stuffing stones into the back-breaking rucksack she will lug down mountain at dusk. It might be a scene from biblical times, but it is not. Leonor Gonzalez climbed that ridge yesterday during the Payaqueo, the hunt for gold her forebears have undertaken since time immemorial. And she will climb it again tomorrow, doing what she has done since she first accompanied her mother to work at the age of 4. Never mind that a Canadian mining company less than 30 miles away is performing the same task more efficiently with hulking 21st century machinery, or just beyond Lake Titicaca, the cradle of Inca civilization, Australian, Chinese, and United States corporate giants are investing millions for state-of-the-art equipment to join the Latin American mining bonanza. The business of digging deep into the earth's entrails to wrest glittering treasures has long, abiding roots on this continent, and in many ways defines the people we Latin Americans have become. Leonor Gonzalez is the embodiment of silver, sword, and stone, the triad of this book's title, 3 obsessions that have held Latin Americans fast for the past millennium. Silver is the lust for precious metals, the infatuation that rules Leonor's life as it has ruled generations before her, a frantic hunt for a prize she cannot use, a substance that is wanted in cities she will never see. The passion for gold and silver is an obsession that burned brightly before Columbus's time, consumed Spain in its relentless conquest of America, drove a cruel system of slavery and colonial exploitation, sparked a bloody revolution, addled the region's stability for centuries, and morphed into Latin America's best hope for the future. Just as Inca and Aztec rulers made silver and gold symbols of their glory, just as 16th century Spain grew rich and powerful as the preeminent purveyor of precious metals, mining remains at the heart of the Latin American promise today. That obsession lives on, the glistening troves extracted and sent away by the boatloads, even though the quarries are finite, even though the frenzy must end. Leonor is no less a product of silver than she is of the sword, Latin America's abiding culture of the strong man that accompanies it, the region's proclivity, as Gabriel Garcia Marquez, José Martí, Mario Vargas Llosa, and others have pointed out, to solve problems by unilateral and alarming displays of power, by brutality, by reliance on muscle, coercion, and an overweening love for dictators and the military. La mano dura, the iron fist. Violence was certainly the easy expedient in the day of the war-loving Moche in 800 AD, but it grew more so under the Aztec and Inca empires, was perfected and institutionalized by Spain under the cruel tutelage of Cortés and Pizarro, and became ingrained during the hellish wars of Latin American independence in the 19th century. State terrorism, dictatorships, endless revolutions, Argentina's dirty war, Peru's shining path, Colombia's FARC, Mexico's crime cartels, and 21st century drug wars. These are its legacies. The sword remains as much a Latin American instrument of authority and power as it ever was 500 years ago, when the Dominican friar Bartolomé de las Casas lamented that the Spanish colonies were choked up with Indian blood and gore. No, Leonor González is no stranger to oppression and violence. Her ancestors, people of the Altiplano, were conquered and forced into labor by the Incas, and then reconquered and enslaved by Spanish conquistadors. For centuries, her people were relocated by force at the whims of the Micmac, the compulsory labor system that the Inca Empire and then Spain demanded of the vanquished. Or they were taken away in the church's reductions, massive resettlements of indigenous populations in the ongoing enterprise to save their souls. In the 19th century, Leonor's people were herded at sword point to fight or be sacrificed on opposing sides of the revolution. In the 20th century, they were driven higher and higher into the snowy reaches of the Andes to escape the wanton massacres of the Shining Path. But even in that airless area, 18,000 feet above sea level, the sword has continued to be the master. Today, in the wild, lawless mining towns of La Rinconada, where murder and rape are rampant, where human sacrifices are offered to mountain demons and no government police chief dares to go, Leonor is as vulnerable to brute force as her forebears were 500 years ago. Every day when she rises, Leonor touches a small stone that she keeps on a ledge by her cot near a faded photograph of her dead husband, Juan Sixto Chochoqui. Every night before she crawls under a blanket with her children and grandchildren, she touches it again. His soul rests inside, she told me when I visited her in her frigid one-room hut, no larger than 10 feet squared, where she lives on the lip of a mountain glacier with 2 sons, 2 daughters, and 2 grandchildren. She and Juan, the ruddy-faced miner in the photo, were never actually married. No one in Leonor's acquaintance has ever taken the church's vows. To her, Juan is her husband and the father of her children, and from the day a mine shaft collapsed and his lungs filled with the deadly fumes that killed him, that round gray stone at the head of her bed has come to represent him, even as it represents the whole of Leonor's spiritual life. Like many indigenous people, from the Rio Grande to the Tierra del Fuego, Leonor accepts Catholic teachings only as they reflect the gods of her ancestors. Virgin Mary is another face for Pachamama, Mother Earth, the ground beneath our feet, from which all bounty springs. God is another word for Apu, the spirit that dwells in mountains, whose energy comes from the sun and lives on in the stones. Satan is Supai, a demanding rascal god who rules death, the underworld, the dark entrails of the ground below, or the ground below ground, and needs to be appeased. Leonor's stone stands for the third obsession that has held Latin America in its grip for the past 1,000 years. The region's fervent adherence to religious institutions, whether they be temples, churches, elaborate cathedrals, or piles of sacred rock. The first order of business when pre-Columbian powers conquered one another 1,000 years ago was to pound the other gods into rubble. With the arrival of the conquistadors of the Americas, the triumphant monuments of stone erected by the Aztecs and the Incas to honor their gods were often reduced to mere pedestals for mighty cathedrals. I want to stop here to say that my sister Vicky, who's here somewhere, and I had the great good fortune of being led through the excavation of the Templo Mayor that's happening under just feet, because the cathedral was built really to gather the energy from the temple of the and the adoratorio, that was of course the sacred place of the gods of the Mexica. The significance of the rubble and building on top of a cathedral, on top of a cathedral on top of a temple, was not lost on the conquered. Rock was piled on rock, palaces were built on top of palaces, a church straddled every important indigenous temple or waka, and religion became a powerful, concrete reminder of who had won the day. Even as time wore on, even as Catholicism became the single most powerful institution in Latin America, even as some of its adherents began to be wooed away by Pentecostalism, Latin Americans have remained a resolutely religious population. They cross themselves when they pass a church, they build shrines in their homes, they carry images of saints in their wallets, they talk to their coca leaves, they hang crosses from rearview mirrors, fill their pockets with sacred stones. Leonor is not alone in her thrall to silver, sword, and stone. The majority of Latin Americans are bound to her by no more than a few degrees of separation. Extracting ore in Mexico, Peru, Chile, Brazil, and Colombia has resumed the primacy it had 400 years ago, and the business of mining has gone a long way to redefine progress, boost economies, lift people out of poverty, and touch every aspect of the social fabric. Precious minerals pass from rural to urban handlers, from brown hands to white, from poor to rich. The gold that is dug from the rock beneath Leonor's hut fuels an elaborate economy. The seedy beer hall, a few steps from her door, the flocks of child prostitutes down mountain in Putina, the bankers in Lima, geologists in Canada, socialites in Paris, investors in China. It is an industry whose profits ultimately go overseas to Toronto, Denver, London, Shanghai, much as gold once crossed the Atlantic Ocean in Spanish galleons and made its way to Madrid, Amsterdam, and Peking. The general flow of revenue has not changed. It lingers briefly, enough for a beer at the cantina, or a fly-bitten shank of goat to hang from the roof beam, and then it goes out, away, over there. The sword, too, has weathered history. From the keenly honed slate blades that Chimu warriors used to disembowel their enemies, to the crude kitchen knives deployed by Zeta gangsters in the Mexican city of Juarez. A culture of violence persists in Latin America, lurking in shadows, waiting to erupt, threatening the region's fitful progress toward peace and prosperity. The sword has been the ever-ready instrument in this precinct of stark inequalities, as useful in Augusto Pinochet's 1970s Chile, among a largely white, literate population, as in today's blood-soaked streets of Honduras, among the illiterate poor. The 10 most dangerous cities in the world are in Latin American countries. Little wonder that the United States has seen a flood of desperate immigrants fleeing Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador. Fear is the engine that drives Latin Americans north. As for the stones purchased on the Spirit, there is no question that organized religion has played and continues to play a crucial role in these Americas. From the days of the Inca, when the great rulers Pachacutec, Inca Yupanqui, Tupac Inca Yupanqui, turned the world and expanded the empire by conquering vast swaths of South America and forcing the vanquished masses to worship the sun, faith has been a weapon of coercion as well as an instrument for social cohesion. The Aztecs shared the Incas' appetite for conquest as well as a keen appreciation for the uses of religion. But they had a starkly different approach to conversion. They often adopted the deities of the newly conquered with the understanding that someone else's God might have much in common with one's own. Stroll through any Mesoamerican or Andean village, or San Miguel de Allende, and you will find lively expressions of these ancient beliefs in contemporary art and ritual traditions. Today, although various Amerindian, African, Asian, and European faiths are practiced in Latin America, the region remains firmly stamped with the one Spain imposed on it more than 500 years ago. It is adamantly Catholic. A full 40% of all the world's Catholics reside here, and as a result, a strong bond unites the believers. From Montevideo, Uruguay, to Monterrey, Mexico. Indeed, Simón Bolívar, who liberated 6 South American republics, imagined the Spanish-speaking Catholic nations of those Americas as a potentially powerful, unified force in the greater world. The Spanish crown may have worked mightily, and it did, to keep its colonies from communicating, trading, or establishing human concord, but it joined them forever when it led them to the feet of Jesus. In the end, Bolívar was never able to fashion a strong Pan-American union from the diverse, restless population of Spanish-speaking Christians that he had liberated. But the church today remains, as it was in Bolívar's time, the most trusted institution in all of Latin America. This is a book about 3 components of Latin American society that have shaped it for about 1,000 years. It does not pretend to be definitive, comprehensive. Rather, it is meant to cast light on the legacy of the Latin American people and on 3 elements of our past that may suggest something about our future. Certainly, there are other obsessions we share that make for a brighter portrait of the region. Our infatuation with art, for instance, our enthusiasm for music, our culinary passions, our love of rhetoric. The Spanish language that flows from the pens of Latin Americans has produced one of the most striking original literatures of our time. There are also few regional traits that shine more brightly than our fidelity to family or our propensity for human warmth. But none of these, in my view, has moved populations, marked the landscape, and written history as forcefully as Latin America's fixations on mining or its romance with brute force or religion. These obsessions are not tidy strands that can be addressed as independent narratives. Their histories over the course of the past 1,000 years have clashed, overlapped, become intricately intertwined, just as gold, faith, and fear are tightly woven skeins in the life of Leonor González. But Latin Americans' inclinations to religion and violence, along with its stubborn adherence to an ancient form of extractive commerce that doesn't necessarily lead to lasting development, have fascinated me for years. I believe the history of these inclinations can tell us much about who we Latin Americans are. And we are, as one historian once said, quote, a continent made to undermine conventional truth. A region unto ourselves, unlike any other, where theories or doctrines fashioned elsewhere seldom have purchase. I also believe that for all the years I've spent following the ways and the warps of this schemed history, it can't possibly tell the whole story. How do you explain a hemisphere and its people? It's an impossible task, really, made more complicated by 500 years of skewed historical record. All the same, I am convinced there is a commonality, a concrete character, if you will, that emerges from the Spanish-American experience. I'm also convinced that this character is a direct product of the momentous confrontation between two worlds. We are defined by the grudging tolerance born of this experience. There is no northern equivalent. In Latin America, we may not always know exactly what breed we represent, but we do know that we are more bound to this new world than we are to the old. After centuries of unrestrained mixing, we are more brown than white, even though we may not want to admit it, more black than Indian, than some might think. But since raw political power has been held stubbornly by every anxious generation of whites since first contact, a true reckoning of our identity has always been a tenuous proposition. Call it what you will, but the enduring presence of indigenous history in Latin America, and this is very true between what I call the axis of Mexico and the Andes, quite unlike its counterpart in the north, suggests that there is a very different explanation here. I offer mine in all humility in hopes of relaying something of the perspective it has given me. Although my father's family has had roots in Peru for almost 500 years, my grandmother, Rosa Cisneros y Cisneros de Arana, was a great enthusiast of all things Spanish. She often spoke to me of Spain's custom of sending sons into different walks of life as a way of building the pillars of a robust society. One son, as the logic went, would be a man of the world, a lawyer, a politician, a businessman. The second, a military man. The third, a priest. The first would ensure prosperity by having a hand in the nation's power and wealth. The second would maintain the peace by serving his country as a soldier. And the third would throw open the gates to heaven by teaching us the way to God. I never saw reference of this custom made in history books, although I heard of it again and again as I traveled the countries of Latin America. In time, I saw that a banker, a general, and a bishop were indeed pillars of our shared society. They were precisely what kept the oligarchy and races in the rigid caste system that Spain had created in the first place. That triumvirate of sovereignty of princes, soldiers, and high priests had held for the Incas, the Muiscas in Colombia, the Mayans and the Aztecs as well. In many cases, a supreme ruler was expected to be all three. Call it what you will, but the formula of triangulated control has worked for centuries in the Americas of the South. It allowed ancient cultures to expand and conquer. It allowed colonizers a firm lock on the pockets, fists, and souls of the colonized. For all Latin America's gifts to the world, for all the storied civilizations of our past, the region continues to be ruled by what has always held sway here: silver, sword, and stone. Thank you very much.
I did not hear any mention of Portugal, the Portuguese influence, or of African slavery. Could you comment?
On the Portuguese as well? Oh, absolutely. This is very much a part of my book as well. So I've focused very much on the Spanish-speaking side of Latin America because it's the side I know best. But Portugal, of course, as we all know, there was a time that the Portuguese were the actually most ruthless and most, I would say, productive slave traders in the world, followed by the Dutch and then the English. But yes, and of course, Brazil was built on slavery to a great degree because, and this was really interesting to speak to the director of Templo Mayor and INAH in Mexico City. The civilizations were used to being driven to, really, hands, backs, human hands and backs were the engine of all of the economies, including, of course, in Brazil, the caciques, who had their troves of either gold mines or emerald mines or whatever they were, had already sort of initiated that whole business of slavery and attribute the Incas were great slave drivers. And the Aztecs, Moctezuma, was a tremendous slave driver. So all of this has a great deep history, and Portugal does not get absolved. Thank you for the question.
Hi, thank you for sharing the first few pages of your book. I was wondering, it seems you mention a kind of top-down approach to the history of Latin America, looking at the colonial legacy, religion as an institution. And I was wondering if your book addresses at all the agency of people from the bottom up and their responses to these types of institutions that kind of kept them oppressed, according to how I understood your presentation.
I'm sorry, I didn't get the whole question completely. Could you, you're talking about the immigration?
No, I'm talking about the agency of people in Latin America who responded to these types of top-down institutions that you refer to. So instead of looking at it from the perspective of, mining, silver, sword, and religion, if you look at the people who actually lived these experiences, yes, and how they responded to it.
Yes, thank you for that question. This is the reason why this is a combination of history and journalism, because what I have at the core of the book are actually three stories. Leonor Gonzalez is only one. She is the story that represents really 1,000 years of history of the obsession with silver and gold. But my other two characters, fantastically interesting characters. One is a Cuban who, young sort of ne'er-do-well Cuban, who went to Angola to fight in the war in Angola, returned to Cuba and became something of a criminal. He was a horse thief, and then he was actually freed by Castro in the Marielitos and came to the United States. So his story goes all the way from Africa to Cuba to the United States and tells something and echoes the history that has gone before. And I try to tell the history and that personal story as well. For Stone, I have a really quite extraordinary Jesuit priest who lives in La Paz, who came over from Barcelona, actually from a little town outside of Barcelona at the age of 15 to be a priest. And he came up through Argentina to Bolivia, and he became, in effect, an Indian because he was the one who was evangelized by the end of the story. So I try to tell something of the arc of history through modern lives so that you can see sort of the trajectory of how history has deeply affected us. Thank you for that question.
Hi. Loved your book about Bolivar and was very struck living in Mexico with the connections with Peru, whether it's Pizarro and Cortes. But could you say more about those specific connections between Mexico and Peru and, not just the broad outlines, but how you look at that?
Well, of course, Cortes was the precursor. I mean, Cortes was the first Spaniard to actually stand in front of a great emperor. Although, Columbus had come to the Caribbean, he really never met anybody important. He met a few Indians whom he put to work, and he, all the way through the history from 1492 to 1519, when Cortes, of course, came up Mexico to Moctezuma, no one had ever seen someone of that stature. Cortes then went back to Spain and was actually there when Pizarro, who was getting old, he was already 45 and he was trying to make something of himself. He was already very rich in Panama, happened to be in Spain at the same time. They met. Cortes told him everything about the conquest of the Mexica and Moctezuma and what he did. And of course, Pizarro did exactly the same thing. The interesting thing, of course, is not that they would do the same thing. They were, Pizarro and Cortes basically grew up in towns very close to one another in the Extremadura. So, they were pretty much the same people. But when you think about it, how was it that the Mexica and the Inca both fell for the same thing? And of course it was because, as fate would have it, their empires were pretty much at war, in ruin, being redefined. Moctezuma was enraged by the kind of commerciality that was going on in his very splintered empire. And he had many enemies, many tribes. The Chichimecas, all the way through the Tlaxcalans, all of them hated Moctezuma and were ready to march with Cortes when he came up. And of course Pizarro after the same thing, did pretty much the same thing. Capture the emperor, tell Spain that you're doing it for Jesus, God, and the church, and then but follow exactly the same pattern. No surprise, of course, because they had met in this when you think of serendipity, two conquistadors meeting and then one passing a kind of torch to the other. So the resemblances are very similar. Simón Bolívar understood this, which is why he tried to create a great sort of Pan-American union, because he understood that at the base of things, even though Spain tried very hard to keep the colonies apart, they were not allowed to trade, you were not allowed to travel, you were not allowed to, as a citizen of any colony, actually plant a vine. Simply, everything had to be done with the approval. This is something that we have very much in our past still, I think in Mexico, certainly in Peru, where the bureaucracy is astounding. Why? It comes from this long line. Bolivar understood this, that there were these connections, that there were these things in common that we had lived through as Latin Americans during the colonial times, and he had hoped to create this strong bulwark against Europeans and North Americans, who at that point were encroaching very much on the possibility of I mean, Jefferson said, little by little, we're going to take over all of Latin America. And he was very, very direct about it. In England, the Prime Minister said, you know, we work in the shadows, but we'll eventually own it. So Bolívar understood this, understood the Pizarro-Cortés connection and the fact that we all have something in common, that there is a real commonality of spirit, if not of actual political connection. Basically, Spain made us enemies, one Latin American country with another, which was a very, very strategic thing to do when you're trying to control your colonies. So it's all kind of connected in my head. Thank you for asking that question.